take a look at finance. Of course, Budget 2022 is being read on Monday. Now, this morning, we're joined by Dr. Faith B. Israel out of Tobago to speak about expectations and to speak about what Tobago needs. Good morning, Dr. B. Israel.
Good morning. Thanks for having me. It's a wonderful sunny day in Tobago, and this is a good day to talk about money.
I agree with you, but any day is a good day to talk about money.
Well, speaking about money, so the first thing I wanted to ask you when I saw this a couple of days ago is the fact that the leader of the PNM Tobago Council came out and said that due to how the debates on the autonomy bills, right, being technically inaccurate here, due to how they went, her claim is that because of the opposition parties, the UNC and the PDP, it cost Tobago $1 billion less of allocation for the next fiscal year. Now, I find that's an interesting claim to make, given the fact that at the end of the day, I'm not entirely sure. First of all, yes, the UNC walked out, but the government has passed bills that they wanted to pass. They've turned everything into simple majorities, and they passed it without the opposition support before. But I honestly don't really see exactly what the PDP did to block that part of Parliament. So it's interesting. I would very much like to hear your take on this.
Sure. I think Mrs. Tracy Davidson Celestine is simply continuing the very racist, the very dog whistle, the very unethical almost practice of trying to link the PDP with the UNC, simply because they're trying to force Tobagonians to be afraid of whoever the UNC are. And the reality is, it really is just a racist statement. Tobagonians are no longer interested in that kind of politics, and we want to talk about real issues. So I will talk about real issues. It's sad, unfortunately, that after Mrs. Davidson Celestine has actually been in the Tobago House of Assembly for all of these years, because remember, this is not her first go around. Mm-hmm. She should have known that in 2000, the Dispute Resolution Commission actually said to the central government of Trinidad and Tobago that you are supposed to give to the Tobago House of Assembly between 4.03 and 6.9% of the national budget. So when she speaks about Tobago losing out of $1 billion because we are not going to get the 6.8% that is recommended, that was recommended in the autonomy bills, she is again being ingenious. She's again being downright wrong, because there is currently a provision to ensure that Tobago can get up to 6.9%. So if her colleagues, and I hope she sends this note to them, if her colleagues actually are interested in giving Tobago the additional $1 billion, they have the right and they have the responsibility and they have the legal backing to give it to us on Monday. So those of us in the PDP, we are waiting with bated breath, because we insist that they should be giving us the 6.9%, and anything less than that shows that all of that discussion about 6.8% in the Tobago autonomy setting was just a farce and was just them trying to rouse us. We expect 6.9% and nothing less on Monday. And let me explain why this is critical. This year, Mr. Joel Jack, on behalf of the Tobago House of Assembly, and I'm putting that very loosely because we know we've been in the 6-6 tie, and Mr. Mann went ahead and did what he wanted as it relates to the Tobago budget without the input of the rest of the PDP assemblymen. But we are not going to talk about that right now. He went ahead and submitted a budget of $4.7 billion. That was the request that was made a couple months ago. Mm-hmm. That $4.7 billion is about $3.07 billion for recurring, which is, the typical light bill and salaries and that kind of thing. About $1.5 billion for for development expenditure, and about $100 million for CPEP and URP. The reality is, though, last year he asked for $4.7 billion last year, and we only got $2.1 billion. So you see, we are used to getting about the 4.03% of the budget, and they've been doing that. PNM in Trinidad, PNM in Tobago. Tobago has been getting the minimum 4.03% of the budget every year for the longest while. Now, this is important to understand, and it goes back to why Mrs. Davidson's conversation about getting the additional $1 billion is important. Because I agree with her. We need the additional $1 billion. And we need it because when you listen to Dr. Vanis James, who is one of our scholars in Tobago, one of our economists that is world-renowned, he has outlined the need for, let's just say if you need in Tobago to get an increase in output every year, a 1% increase in output every year, he is suggesting that what we need is about $600 million of investment every year. But because Tobago is so behind of everything in Trinidad and Tobago, what Tobago needs is actually about 6 to 8% growth every year. And that 6 to 8% growth every year means that we need at least $3.5 billion of investment into the Tobago economy every single year. That works out, according to him, to about $2 billion coming from the government and another $1.5 billion coming from private sector. So if the Tobago House of Assembly really is to inject into the Tobago economy that $2 billion every year, then the THA really does need at least that $4.7 billion. That is what we are requesting now, and a little bit more. And I am hoping that Mrs. Tracy Davidson Celestine speaks to her PNM counterparts in Trinidad, because we will not agree with a dollar, a cent less than that $4.7 billion.
Well, according to Mr. Joel Jack, the Minister of Finance, since he entered office in 2015, has been giving beyond the minimum of 4.3%. Is that accurate?
No, it's not accurate. When you do the calculations, and as a matter of fact, what they do is about 4.3, not 4.03. So I guess technically that is a little bit more than the absolute minimum. But what I think they do is actually just do the entire budget, whatever the total budget is for the nation, calculate what 4.3% of that is, and then divide it among the votes in Tobago. Because coincidentally, when you do the calculations every year, it comes up to exactly 4.3% for the last couple years. So he is very disingenuous. He's almost lying if he states that what is done is actually more than that. What they try to do is they try to then put into the budgets of other ministries. So, for example, the fact that they are doing the airport project,
right.
The fact we're talking about, for example, that Marriott project, those things are being done under the central government, and they try to say they are including that kind of money because it is being, quote unquote, spent in Tobago. But that is not what the Dispute Resolution Commission said. They talked about the money being spent by the Tobago House of Assembly, not the money just being spent in Tobago by central government ministries. There is a difference.
And what makes that even more disingenuous is the fact that it seems that nobody on the THA was aware about the Marriott deal until it was announced, as you mentioned.
Nobody was even aware that they had a bidding process which ended in August.
But one thing, though, I find it interesting that since they seem to be sticking to the minimum and wanting to control the extra money via central government channels, I do have to ask, does this seem as though that the government is fine with Tobago remaining dependent on Trinidad, as opposed to trying to get the economy of Tobago to some degree of independence, which, that would fly in the face of their claims about wanting to push forward the issue of the autonomy bill? Because it seems to me what Tracy David Celestine was doing was, after all the criticisms with the fact that they control the THA, they control Parliament, they can't push autonomy through, it's ultimately their fault, it seems as though she's trying to redirect that narrative to be able to basically bring autonomy as an issue that she's going to champion for the upcoming current THA elections.
And that is exactly what they're doing, and that is why this Tobago autonomy issue, we have been saying it for years, has been a political football. We knew that at the beginning of last year, when they started talking about it, that this is exactly what they were going to do. We knew this. We knew this. The playbook has been used over and over and over again. You would hear them. PNM tried to give you all autonomy. Those on the other side is the one who prevented it from happening. And of course, they are linking those on the other side, as in the PDP, with the UNC, again, bringing up that very racist kind of campaigning that they do. But the thing is that Tobagonians have been listening. Tobagonians have understood what's going on. Tobagonians understand now that the current DRC recommendation is that Tobago gets between 4.03 and 6.9%. So no one is really listening to her and accepting what she says as serious. She's simply proving herself to be unworthy of leadership for Tobago. And I think that Tobagonians in the next election will show that she is really unworthy to be our leader, because we need a leader that will champion autonomy for Tobago. We need a leader that would champion the fight to ensure that Tobago comes out of this state of dependence. That is what we have been fighting for. That is what we've been pushing for. And the Progressive Democratic Patriots, we will do that for this island.
Well, Dr. B. Israel, speaking about a state of dependence, it is also being stated that Tobago is looking to establish its own heritage fund. Is that something that is necessary now? I mean, considering the COVID-19 pandemic and there are rainy days ahead, is that something that should be on the front burner? How is it that you can save money when it is you may not be getting enough to cover your expenses?
So that is actually something that we would welcome, and we would go even further than to suggest that we start from scratch, because we know, as in those of us in Tobago who are honest with ourselves, knows that a big chunk of the revenues that goes into the National Heritage and Stabilization Funds actually comes from areas that we would classify as Tobago waters. So what the PDP would actually fight for is not so that we start from scratch, is that we actually get at least that 6.9% of the current Heritage and Stabilization Fund as our base, and then we build from that. Anything other than that would be accepting this idea that Tobago has been contributing nothing to the economy of Trinidad and Tobago, which we is an absolute lie, and we are not going to allow anyone to keep practicing that kind of narrative, because it is simply not true.
But I must also bring, because we have to put this into context as well, the COVID-19 pandemic. We've been in this for the last 2 years, and how has the management of the COVID-19 pandemic affected what is to come for Tobago?
The management, unfortunately, has ensured that the average Tobagoan who is in need of real COVID-19 relief has not actually gotten it. Unfortunately, I keep meeting mothers, I keep meeting fathers, I keep meeting individuals who are saying, you know, we applied to the relief fund way back when, we still ain't get it, the 1,005 or whatever it was. Are we even still getting that? And now we've gone back to regular life almost. What is happening? We still have all of that debt. Now, the reality is that the management of the COVID-19 is really just an example of how badly we've managed everything else in Tobago under the current leadership. And that is why we have to honestly make a change. I think we are at the point where those who are currently there are tired. They've run out of ideas. They no longer understand what are the wants and needs of Tobagonians, and we should allow them to take that little leave, take that rest, and allow people who understand what is necessary in every respect to take charge in Tobago, so that we can come out of this with some semblance of normalcy, with some semblance of growth, with some semblance of economic development.
And Dr. B. Israel, you know, I must be devil's advocate here, and I have to ask, how would you respond to those who suggest that Tobago and Tobagonians are asking for too much, that they only contribute to the economy of Trinidad and Tobago through tourism, whether it be through domestic tourism or international tourism. How would you respond that Tobago is just asking for too much and is asking for beyond what it actually contributes?
You know, that is one of the reasons why when we were having the discussions about Tobago autonomy, those of us on this side of the discussion were saying that one thing that was critical for us was to include in the documents real and accurate definitions of what is Tobago. What was written in the documents is that Tobago would have been just the island of Tobago and initially no sea boundaries, no water or marine boundaries. And that's why we kept pushing back at that. Because we know, we have fishermen friends, for example, who are fishing off of the coast of Castara, or even some of my fishermen friends right here in Belgrade, who are telling me that when they go out a couple miles, they are next to oil rigs. And when Shell, for example, is doing their seismic exploration, or when the BHP Billington is doing their thing, they are the ones who get the notice saying, you know what, you can't do because we are doing exploration, or you can't do this here because there's a pipeline going from what we would classify as Tobago waters going to Trinidad to be refined. So that is why we were so careful in insisting on the definition of Tobago not be limited to just the land space and no water, because we know if Trinidad and Tobago were separated, as in created two different countries, the resources that would be in Tobago's waters would actually be a significant proportion of the resources that are used by Trinidad and Tobago right now. So we know that we are contributing way more than just tourism. We know this.
I find it rather amazing that how in-depth this discussion of autonomy goes, how clear definitions need to be in order to get a better understanding as to how it affects the entire operations and economy of Tobago.
Well, consider this. I think we've seen both with public health, with tourism, with a lot of issues, crime, where the situations between the two islands are different and they need different approaches with regards to with the lands and deeds, with the records or the lack thereof, and how that's being resolved. And I just find it interesting that with regards to tourism, the tourism on the two islands are different, yet the two incredibly large projects that are currently either underway or being pushed forward are under the control of central government, all the while there are claims about autonomy being made. And in the case of one, it was potentially done without even the knowledge of the party members in Tobago. So to me, and if you want to have the debate on whether autonomy is right or wrong, that's separate. They've made the claims that they want autonomy, and the actions seems to not really be even in line with that ideology of trying to get Tobago to have autonomy. Because as a Trinidadian, I would want Tobago to have autonomy with regards to the fact that if Tobago is financially independent, or more so, it's only better for everybody.
Exactly. And I would even jump in to say that the two large projects, not just the Marriott one, the airport one, was also done without the input of the Tobago. Because I remember going to that first consultation that was done a couple of years ago, and it was very, very clear that the members representing the Tobago House of Assembly had absolutely no information about what was happening. And even more, following that, after the Prime Minister was asked about those consultations, he's the one who actually said, oh, what consultations are you all talking about? We didn't give authorization to have any consultations. And that is why the promises, for example, that were made at the initial consultations, none of them have been kept, because those were Tobago House of Assembly trying to make it sound good, when in fact those were not the plans of the central government of Trinidad and Tobago. So again, going back to this idea that if Tobago really is to be autonomous, the Tobago House of Assembly should have been doing both projects, the airport projects, because, by the way, under the current Tobago House of Assembly Act, infrastructure, including air and sea transport infrastructure, which is airport and seaport, is under the Tobago House of Assembly. So there's absolutely no reason for the central government to even be doing that airport project under the current law.
Well then, technically, would that make the airport in Crown Point, the new airport, illegal?
Well, if we push it, we could definitely, because really it should be the Tobago House of Assembly doing that. But the PNM counterparts in Tobago have, in essence, been giving back to Trinidad in every circumstance that they can, the responsibilities that they should have held on to in Tobago. But don't worry, the election is coming soon, and the PDP has plans to change order.
And that actually leads me to my final question, Dr. B. Israel. Do you think that the only way autonomy would happen for the people of Tobago, for Tobago, is that if there is no association between those within the THA and those within central government in terms of the party politics? Because I'm looking here at 2013, when the People's Partnership government were in power, and the People's National Movement won all 12 seats, but autonomy didn't even happen then. So is there a linkage between a sitting THA party and a sitting central government that actually does not allow for autonomy to happen?
Well, the reality is, if you look at the versions of the Tobago House of Assembly Act that we have now, they have all happened when there was non-PNM-led Tobago House of Assembly, non-PNM-led Tobago leadership happening. So that is the answer. Tobago needs to get rid of the People's National Movement as it relates to governance on the island, and then we can get proper autonomy, because that is what happened before. That is what happened to get the current Tobago House of Assembly acts that we have, and that is what's going to need to happen to get a greater autonomy. And the Progressive Democratic Patriots is the organization that would be leading that charge, and we are not going to be playing with it. We are not going to be, as I say, pussyfooting with it. We are going to make sure that it actually happens, because that is why the Tobagonians are voting for us.
Dr. Faith B. Israel, thank you very much for joining us this morning. As always on Talking Points, we enjoy having you on the program and for the stimulating conversation that actually answers questions for Sean and I and for those who are viewing. So we appreciate your presence on the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
Have a great weekend.
Thank you, Dr. Israel.
And of course, all eyes are on Budget 2022. So we'll keep in contact throughout the day on Monday. Anyway, folks, Dr. Faith B. Israel out in Tobago, thank you once more for joining us. So we now have a better understanding of the discussions and the dialogue as to what has been put out there by Mr. Joel Jack and the THA versus what may be reality. And it's amazing how Dr. B. Israel was able to explain how a simple definition of Tobago could affect, the economy.
I think, and the problem is at the end of the day, and we've seen these debates in the UK, we've seen these debates in Spain. This is not something unique. This is not just, these people are crazy and this doesn't make sense. There's precedent for this. And the fact of the matter is, there's practical reasons for it, because the Tobago does have its differences in how best to be run. And not everything that comes out of Parliament is going to automatically be fine for Tobago. And you could even argue that we do have to look now at local government and necessarily consider, okay, is the local government structure elsewhere in the country also correct? Or are there things that could be done better? But because Tobago is so separated geographically, in that it makes certain things impractical,
do you think
there would be more need for Tobago to have a certain degree of different management.
To what extent, and I'm trying to figure out why this autonomy never happened for Tobago, to what extent do you think Trinidad is dependent upon Tobago for income, be it tourism? Do you think that the central government in Trinidad and Tobago is actually concerned that they may lose out if they give Tobago autonomy?
I think the only thing that with regards to financial gain would be the energy resources that would be in the waters of Tobago. So there is that. Now, to what extent should central government have jurisdiction on that? Because it's not as though if you find oil in Mayaro, it's not as though all of a sudden Mayaro, But again, the flip side is, because Tobago is treated as though, well, you all don't contribute anything and you all just sponge off of the rest of us, quote unquote. Don't mind that it's not as though the bulk of the country is responsible for the energy. The oil and gas comes from, offshore, wherever. It's not beholden to any one section of the population. So if we wanted to hold all of the energy resources of the country, under central government, Tobago has rights to their fair share of that money, just as the rest of the country does.
But do you think Tobago could finance themselves if they were to get autonomy?
It all depends on how you define it. It just
Which
all
goes
depends
back
on
into
how-
what Dr.
how you-
Israel was
because,
saying, yeah.
Because again, there are a lot of areas of the country that cannot finance themselves, right? They are dependent on the energy, the money that the energy sector makes, that the Ministry of Energy makes off of taxes or direct revenue, etc. And then that's distributed throughout the country. But then, of course, now, again, it goes back to me the statement of, well, Tobago contributes nothing. Technically, Tobago contributes just as much as any other borough, district, city, corporation, whatever. Because most of the energy is not even on the land, it's in the sea.
So then Tobago is a borough of Trinidad?
No.
Let's just not get into defining it
No.
ourselves. Let's not define it ourselves.
Just now, I was being very inaccurate and technically inaccurate in my statements. But the point was that it comes back down to that. It comes back down to when Tobago has to ask for money, right? It gives a very strange power dynamic. And more importantly, with regards to certain legislations particularly, there's a need for Tobago to just be able to manage it themselves.
Well, there you have it, and we now understand why it is absolutely vital, it's crucial to have clear definitions, because as you can tell, it affects every single thing. So again, thank you very much to Dr. Faith B. Israel. We are going to take a break here for news on the hour on WESN. When we return, the phone lines will be opened where we would like to hear from you, the viewer, this morning. So stay tuned to the program here on Talking Point.